first cougar, which is racism, not race. I first want to start off with an introduction. Dr. Joseph Graves received his bachelor's from Oberlin College and then went on to receive his doctorate in environmental, evolutionary, and systematic biology from Wayne State University in 1988. Less than 10 years later, in 1994, he was elected a fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. He has also been commemorated as an outstanding graduate by Oberlin College and by the National Science Foundation as one of the Sensational 60. Dr. Graves has held positions at the University of California, Irvine, and Arizona State University, and Fairleigh Dickinson University before joining North Carolina A&T State University, where he is the MacKenzie Scott Endowed Professor of Biology in the Department of Biology. What's noteworthy is that he's at North Carolina A&T, which is a public, historically Black land grant research university in Greensboro, North Carolina. NCA&T boasts as the largest HBCU in the country and produces more Black engineers than any other campus in the country. Now, Dr. Gray's research is highly innovative. His research is in the evolutionary genomics of adaptation and how that shapes our understanding of biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials. Two things I never thought I'd say in one sentence. Dr. Graves holds the title as the director of the just awarded Genomics Research and Data Science Center for Computation and Cloud Computing, also known as GRADS 4C. He's also the associate director for precision microbiome engineering, as well as the director for North Carolina's Amgen Biotech experience. Overall, his research is the definition of innovation, and that's just not my opinion. He was named as an Innovator of the Year in the U.S. Black Engineer magazine. He has been named Researcher of the Year by North Carolina A&T for the past 3 years, and he was named in Community Engaged Teacher of the Year in 2023. But when not being Researcher of the Year or Teacher of the Year or in full director mode, he draws upon his background in evolutionary biology and genetics and has written multiple books that address myths and theories of race in American society. His recent releases include A Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help solve our biggest problems, and Racism, Not Race. I am in search for Dr. Graves' doppelganger because if his scholarly contributions were exceptional, he commits time to his community. He leads programs addressing underrepresented minorities in science, has aided underserved youth in Greensboro via the YMCA Chess program, and has also served on the Racial Reconciliation and Justice Commission and COVID Vaccination Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese. I said it right in my head, but of North Carolina. So today we will hear Dr. Graves speak on racism, not race. And please, if you have questions on the chat, because I know there's people joining us online, please go ahead and post them and they'll be read at the end. And we'll also take questions from the audience. Thank you all for being here.
You sure you want to put that where I'm going to knock that over?
I trust you. I trust you.
You trust me better than I trust myself. So before I start, I wanted to give you an explanation of why I'm here today, specifically at Columbia University's School of Public Health. I'm actually at a point in my career where I don't travel much anymore. I mean, a big prestigious university in Switzerland asked me to come there to give a talk last week. And I told them, sorry, not getting on a plane, not going to Switzerland, okay? You can have my talk by Zoom. And the reason I do this is because, you know, my family is literally the epitome of the subject that I'm going to discuss today. I have a chronically ill son who, can't really live by himself and requires the care of both his parents, 24/7. I have a wife who has a heart condition. And every time I get on a plane, every time I get in the car, I don't know that I'm going to see her alive when I come back home. So for me to decide to take a talk in person means that that invitation had to be of such clarity with regard to the value of me being there in person for me to say, okay, I'm going to get on that plane and I'm going to go to New York. Dr. Govia, you gave such an invitation that inspired me to be here today. So I'm very, very honored. Plus to have been given an introduction like that. I mean, seriously, come on. You must have been talking about the doppelganger because it clearly wasn't me. So anyway, I began to think about why and how people thought racially in our society in the early 1990s. And that brought forth The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. Now, this book basically provides the reader with the history of how these racial ideas developed in both the biological sciences and in the social sciences and the humanities. Now, shortly after, I followed with The Emperor's New Clothes with the race myth. Now, the race myth assumed that you knew about this history and therefore continued the discussion of the ongoing pathologies that exist in our society, particularly in biomedical research, that result from these false premises about human biological variation. And after I finished the race myth, I really thought I would never have to write another book about race again, because the points were so clear that only someone who completely disengaged their intellectual capacity or their moral and ethical features could actually believe that humans still have biological races, or that these biological attributes of these false categories were responsible for the positions of human beings in the social structures that exist across the planet. I said to myself, I'm done. I dropped the mic. I'm done with this. After all, I'm an evolutionary geneticist who studies, fruit flies and bacteria. But stuff happened. And my good colleague, Alvin Goodman, former president of the American Anthropological Association, called me up in 2019 and said, Joe, we need to write a book addressing these ongoing misconceptions about race in humans. And I said, Alan, you're right. So we went to work on Racism, Not Race. And the idea was to give people tools who want to make a positive difference in the world and are confused about the issues. So giving them short, concise answers that they can engage folks in conversation about these misconceptions was the goal. So Racism, Not Race was officially published in 2022, but came out in December of 2021, and Kyrgyz Reviews named it as one of the top nonfiction books of 2021, was also named as one of the top books about being Black in America in 2021, even though the book is really not about being Black, it's about being anybody, but hey, I'll take the honor if it's given, right? So now in Racism, Not Race, we provide concise and accessible answers to questions about race and racism. These have been gleaned from our conversations with students, educators, policymakers, friends, and family. Our book is for readers who want to work towards human equity and for readers who are nervous about saying the wrong thing. And in many cases, the two groups overlap. Over the course of our careers, we have found that there is an ongoing confusion concerning the meaning and significance of human biological variation in relation to disease predisposition. Now, I haven't stopped with Racism, Not Race, because these misconceptions are manifest. So in a paper with my good colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup, who teaches the pathology course at Duke University, Ongoing Racial Misconceptions in Medical Education was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in February of 2022. Shortly after that, The Myth of the Genetically Sick African for Genealogy, was published in that same year. And probably one of the most significant papers published in the journal Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health with my colleagues, Dr. Patricia Harvey, Meredith Spence Bolio, and Jill Branford, Embedded Racism in Equitable Niche Construction as a Neglected Evolutionary Process Affecting Health, came out in EvMed Public Health later in 2023. Now, that paper, by the way, was the most read paper in the journal for several months. Now, most relevant chapters in R&R. I'm going to refer to the book from here on as R&R. Are chapter 1 for this audience, setting the table. Chapter 2, how did race come to be and why is it still so important? Chapter 3, everything you wanted to know about genetics and race. Chapter 5, why do races differ in disease incidence? And chapter 6, I'm assuming I can let these people in. Life history, aging, and mortality. Chapter 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities. Chapter 8, races, brains, and behaviors. And chapter 10, DNA and ancestry testing. Now, did this thing move? I don't have to let them in, so I'm not going to let them in. Okay, you can do that. So I need to move the slides, though, right? Okay, so now, you undoubtedly heard authors repeat this platitude. Race is not a scientific concept. Humanities, social science scholars do it all the time. This is not correct. It fails because it conflates two very different concepts with two very different histories. So first, I'm going to talk about the biological race concept. This concept actually begins in the Western world in Christian special creationism. So biology in the Western world didn't start on an evolutionary framework. We don't have that until the latter portion of the 19th century. So special creationism, of course, had to address the new discoveries that Europeans in the age of discovery were making about people around the globe that they'd never seen before. So they had to explain who these people were, how they got there, and why they were different. And some of the best biology of the early 18th and the late 18th and early 19th century came from people who were special creationists. People like Owen, people like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. They didn't have an evolutionary understanding in the sense of descent with modification. They were explaining the variation in the species that these European discoverers, or explorers were coming in contact with, because their previously existing paradigm was one in which organisms were fixed and unchanging. And so they were coming in contact with things that were different and they needed to explain it. So they started with the morphology or the physical attributes of the organisms. And then in the 19th century, this shifted to the geographical location in which these organisms were found. Now, the chief theorist of this was the founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, Louis Agassiz, Swiss-born naturalist, who was actually recruited to the United States to begin developing an American infrastructure of biology that simply didn't exist before. Now, another thing you don't know about Agassiz, or many of you don't know, is that when he comes to the United States in the 1850s, he purposely injects himself into the discussion about race. Because if you remember American history in the 1840s and 1850s, race was at the center of all of our political debates engaged with the institution of slavery. And so Agassiz, being the consummate showman that he was, wanted to make his science relevant to the learned people of the country. Justice Roger B. Taney, in the Dred Scott decision, relies on Agassiz's thinking about the separate creation of centers of life as his justification for why Dred Scott did not have the rights that a white person had, because he was literally not a member of the same species. So that was the biology accepted in the middle of the 19th century. It wasn't based upon descent with modification. It wasn't based upon natural selection. It was based upon a special act of creation by a God who was white and who created white people at the superior position relative to all other people. Now, in the 20th century, after evolution by the means of natural selection becomes the dominant biological paradigm, okay, now the description of human groups, whether they be, populations or races, is now based upon the frequency of genes. Now, this required a great deal of experimental work, great deal of theoretical work in what was called the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And some of the greatest thinkers and people who were my direct progenitors were involved in this. Okay, now, white racism didn't disappear because now people were using evolutionary theories. But at the same time, the folks who were most responsible for debunking the notion of biological race in our species were evolutionary biologists and biological anthropologists guided by natural selection and descent with modification. It's another point most people don't know. Now, later in the 20th century, we get whether a group is a unique phylogenetic lineage as a criterion by which race can be defined in any species. So one of the things that's different in the history of the biological race concept is that it was applied to all living organisms with biparental inheritance upon the planet. It was not simply an examination of human beings. However, the socially constructed or socially defined race concept was only ever about human beings. It arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, the reason that Alan and I chose Racism, Not Race as the title for our book is to make the point that racism drove the classification of human beings into hierarchical groups, not the underlying biological variation and the attributes of supposed groups. And the only purpose of this classification was to determine who would have rights and privileges within racially stratified societies. Okay, now, from having said what I just said, using the 20th century criteria for population variation, you should recognize that our species, anatomically modern humans, does not contain biological races. I'm actually not going to spend the majority of this talk establishing that for you because it's been so eloquently established in other places. But I do have a chapter. We do have a chapter about that in the book. So if you need a review of why we don't have biological races, please do that, okay? So, but we do have geographically based genetic variation. And some of that is relevant to understanding disease predisposition, but not in the way of the classic ideas of racial medicine, which, by the way, still dominates, okay, clinical practice today. To make the point, Dr. Andrea Dayrup and I, in the last 2 years, have given over 70 grand round lectures at leading medical schools in the United States and Canada. We field the questions from the audience. These practicing physicians still operate in the world of racial medicine. Okay, and there are other, studies of the thinking of practicing clinical physicians that demonstrate that they are still within the paradigm of racial medicine, one which we must rapidly dismantle. So, let's give you a quick couple of points. So, I've already talked to you about the neo-Darwinian synthesis, okay? And here's a point made by one of the architects, Ernst Mayr, who said, the concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes or subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn in sexual species, consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concept are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomist, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary. Now, Mayr is using the term subspecies as a synonym for geographical race. Now, I was talking to my class last night, one I teach at North Carolina State University, which is not my university, on out of Africa. Do you know that the majority of Americans, by socially defined race, do not accept that the human species first evolved in Africa? 67.5% of persons who socially identify as white do not accept that. Okay, 63.5% of those who socially are identified as Hispanic do not accept that. 53.1% of African Americans do not accept that. Now, it's also related to individuals' age, to the portion of the country geographically they live in, and also to their religiosity, which we measured. Okay, and they don't accept the overwhelming scientific evidence that our species first evolved in Africa. So I asked my class last night, okay, to look at the multi-regional model of evolution, which was held first by Franz Wiedenreich in the early portion of the 20th century, and his descendants, Millard Wolfert and group, who are still at Michigan. Okay, Wolfert's a nice guy. I actually was at a conference with him in Poland. He's wrong about multi-regional evolution, but still a nice person. So, here's one of the things you can't explain by multi-regional evolution. Okay, there's a direct relationship between the heterozygosity of human populations and their geographic distance from East Africa. This only happens through serial migration. Okay, alleles are lost due to genetic drift. Okay, and as people migrated around the globe, they lost more and more alleles. And so most of the genetic variation within our species resides in Africa. And every other population is a subsampling of African genetic variation due to genetic drift. Okay, can't explain that by multi-regional evolution. And there are other evidences that demonstrate that that can't be true. Now, there has been local adaptation during human migration, okay? Now, but you would be surprised how little of this adaptation we actually have strong evidence for at the genomic level. For example, this paper, which was published by Fan et al. In 2016 in Science, shows you the traits for which we have very strong evidence of local adaptation. And there are some of the things you would expect, like skin color. Strong decline in skin color from the tropics to the Arctic. And that's associated with protection from solar intensity. Other things, adaptation to avoid parasitic organisms like malaria. Now, even though this document or this figure shows G6PD, HBB, etc., and points to Africa, you should be aware that these variants exist from southern Spain, through Italy, through the Balkans, through the Saudi Peninsula into India. So adaptation to malaria is not an African thing. It's a presence or absence of malaria thing. Now, we have other adaptations such as lactase persistence. Now, medical textbooks still call this condition lactose intolerance, which again, I'm like, what planet are you on when you don't understand that all mammals turn off the lactase enzyme once they're young or weaned? Why would you keep an enzyme working that you don't use anymore? Natural selection would never support that. So the vast majority of people in the world turn off their enzymes because they didn't domesticate cows or other milk-giving mammals. It's only lactose intolerance because persons of European descent domesticated cows, and they think it's normal to have lactase persistence. And so in their medical textbooks, it's called lactose intolerance. So as I was talking with, please tell me your name again. Carla. As I was talking to Carla, one of the most widely used textbooks of pathology in the world, Robbins and Kumar's Basic Pathology, I was called in as a consultant to do the revision of the 11th edition. So guess what? Not lactose intolerance in the 11th edition. So those of you that are teaching pathology, please use the book because we took out most of the racial medicine in it in the 11th edition. Okay. So other stuff. Okay. Now, you all probably know, since this is Columbia, not some podunk school in the middle of god-awful nowhere, that there are about 20,000 protein coding genes in the human genome. How many genes are up here on this figure? There's not 20,000, which means that there has been adaptation during that migration around the globe, but there hasn't been a whole lot of it. And it's been the stuff that you would expect. But what you're not seeing is a lot of evidence of polygenic adaptation. Okay, there's two examples here. Selection for height in Northern Europe and selection for the rainforest phenotype in Central Africa and Brazil. Okay, those are two polygenic traits there. Personality isn't there. Intelligence isn't there, even though David Reich, in his book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, calls me out by name in the concluding chapter, saying Graves is nuts for saying there hasn't been selection for intelligence. There must have been. Well, I'm like, show me the beef. Where's the evidence? Okay. Put forward a testable scientific hypothesis to explain why some group of people should be smarter than others. So they tried it with life history theory. But unfortunately for them, guess who did his PhD in life history theory? So Rushton got thoroughly debunked in a series of papers that I published in the early 2000s. By the way, you can see the Graves-Rushton debate on YouTube. Search Graves-Rushton debate. It was bad. It was like Ali Frazier the second time. Okay, you know, I gave him a chance to go to the neutral corner, but he didn't get up. So then they came up, he and Jensen, okay, came up with the winter selection theory. You want to talk about the dumbest theory in the history of theories. And basically their theory is, because Eurasians move to a place where there's winter, and you could question their intelligence right from the start, right? Why would you leave the tropics to go to a place where there's winter? But that's another discussion for another day. But the idea is that they get to the temperate zones and there's winter. And therefore, you have to have more planning to hunt animals. You have to have more planning to store food. You have to have greater brain capacity to come up with new implements. But you know, in Africa, there are 8 different climatic zones. And humans walked across Africa too. And therefore, what, they didn't have to solve new problems when they went from one climatic zone to another just because it's the tropics? So these are the kinds of theories which people put forward to come up with a justification for why evolution would have made one group of people or some groups of people smarter than others. So, and they just fall on their face just from first principles. So the only other way you're going to get this is by pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is selection for one thing leading to an enhancement of some other thing that was unintended. But again, once we look across the genome for these pleiotropic effects, you can't sustain that model for very long because you have so many other selection pressures going on all over the globe during this migration. So, you know, what Reich accused me of is basically saying to the guy who spent his entire career doing selection experiments with real organisms that Graves doesn't know how to do selection experiments and he doesn't understand the theory. Well, different way of thinking, I would say. So one of the things which ancient DNA is telling us, by the way, is that a trait which plays so much significance in modern day racial classification, skin color, comes about very late, as in lighter skin color, comes about very late in human evolution. So ancient DNA, for example, of the Vestinice people who lived in Italy between 32 and 24,000 years ago shows that they most likely still had the dark-skinned African variants. Another study by Alade et al., published in 2014, looking at a 7,000-year-old Neolithic child in northern Spain, showed that that child still had the ancestral dark-skinned alleles. So based upon what we have of ancient DNA, we think that fair skin evolved maybe 10,000 years ago or so, along with blonde hair, blue eye, coalescence go back to 6,000 to 8,000 years. So these traits, which were the basis of so much claims of supremacy, are things that actually appear extremely late in the evolution of our species. So now, I'm going to change tact, because what I was just talking about was the evolution of human biological variation, and talk about what medicine believed in the 19th century and what it still believes in the 21st century. And by the way, since I have a tendency to go off into flights of erudition, someone should tell me when I'm getting close to the end of the time so I can summarize. So 1799, Africans and Europeans generally suffered from the same diseases and disabilities. However, they thought some were unique to Africans. Harvey and Lindsay defined Cachexia africana, which is dirt eating, which they associated with emotional distress and depression. Now, it turns out that dirt eating is a behavior that is often observed in tropical populations, but it is associated with iron deficiency. This is a way of getting iron when you need it. Tiedemann says darker skin allowed Africans to withstand heat and humid conditions better than Europeans. Tiedemann was probably correct about that, okay, because darker skin protects you better from ultraviolet damage. Cartwright in 1850, Negro consumption was somehow different from white consumption. And those of you know that consumption is tuberculosis. He also comes up with the all-time crazy disease, drapetomania, or the irrational desire of Negroes to run away from slavery. Of course, you should want to stay enslaved, okay? Now, unfortunately, you probably know that in North Carolina, we are now required in our public schools to teach about the beneficial effects of slavery on Black people. Yeah, that law passed. Passed in Florida, passed in Tennessee, passed in North Carolina. So maybe Cartwright was right. Maybe because slavery was so beneficial, those Black folks were suffering from a mental illness. We may never know. Or dysthesia, disease that caused slaves to perform tasks in a haphazard manner. Because after all, you should want to work hard and work yourself to death to enrich another group of people while you're not being paid a dime. Again, some strange form of mental illness. But these kinds of racial misconceptions have not disappeared from medicine in the 21st century. Sally Seitel, in a New York Times op-ed, I am a racially profiling doctor. Okay, May 5th, 2002. Practicing medicine, I am not colorblind. I always take note of my patient's race. So do many of my colleagues. We do it because certain diseases and treatment responses cluster by ethnicity. Now note the mistake she makes in her statement. She is conflating socially defined race with ethnicity. They aren't the same thing. Now, this study, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016, these are false beliefs about biological variation at high prevalence in UVA medical students. The University of Virginia is a premier medical school. They don't just look anybody in off the street. I know, I've given lectures there several times. So, Blacks age more slowly than whites. Excuse me? Okay, 50% of residents believe that. Black nerve endings less sensitive than whites. Okay, 12.7, 19.4, first, second year, 14.3% of residents. Now, what do you think the implications of that false belief were? I know because it took me the longest time to get my knee replaced. Because physicians kept underestimating the pain I was describing. I tell them this knee hurts at 9.5. They would write down 2.3. It took me years to convince them that they should give me a new knee. Black blood coagulates more quickly than whites. Black skin is thicker than white. Blacks have stronger immune systems than whites. Well, if that's true, then why? Well, of course, it would be true if you aged more slowly that you had stronger immune systems. The two are correlated. Now, there are real problems with these typological beliefs. First, people who are defined as Black in the United States, okay, are an admixed population with varying amounts of European ancestry. And depending upon which region of the country, they may have more or less. So, for example, in West Virginia, people socially defined as African American have at least, on average, 30% European ancestry. In Washington State, it's about 20 to 25%. In Kansas, it's about 20%. National average is 16.6%. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that most of this admixture came during chattel slavery. Now, how do we know that? Because there are disproportionate European Y chromosomes in persons of African descent. Y chromosomes are transmitted father to son. Okay, and disproportionate African mitochondrial DNAs, which are transmitted from mother to daughter. Okay, if this were a mutually agreeable relationship situation, that wouldn't be true. Now, we also know about regions of Africa where enslaved people were taken, which is really not the subject of this lecture, so I'm going to pass that slide. The people who are defined as Latin American also have different amounts of admixture based upon the history of the region. So Puerto Rico, for example, again, these are average figures, show 72% European ancestry, 16% Amerindian ancestry, and 12% African ancestry. And they're quite different from Mexico, where it's 51% Amerindian ancestry and only 46% European, and only about 3% African. In Peru, it's 80% Amerindian ancestry, only about 18% European, and only about 2% African. And then the average for Colombia is 64% European, 29% Amerindian, and 7% African. However, in all of these countries, there are populations who do not meet the national averages. For example, in the city of Medellin, you see numbers that approach the national average with regard to ancestry. But in the neighboring state of Chocó, which was a site of plantation agriculture and the importation of large numbers of people from Africa, their admixture profile looks like that of African Americans, although with much more Amerindian ancestry than you would see in African Americans. Now, these people in Colombia consider themselves Colombians. They only become racialized when they come to the United States. And then people start calling them Black or white, depending upon, physical traits. Now, you also know that in the history of the United States, because of the rule of hypodescent, any detectable African ancestry made you Black. So therefore, most people who are socially defined as European, American, or white are pretty much 98% European in their ancestry. And this can differ depending upon which DNA company you use, whether you're British, Irish, or Scandinavian, or Southern European, etc. So now, having said that, to understand why we can't rely on, racialized biology as an accurate predictor of disease, we really need to understand what the causes of disease are. So first cause are genetic causes. So there are simple genetics, and for things that are really bad, we can predict the frequency of these really bad genes like cystic fibrosis or Jenkins syndrome by mutation selection balance, meaning natural selection eliminates these traits from populations, particularly since they can't be treated effectively, the individuals can't reproduce. And the only way that they come back into the population is by the mutation rate, hence the term mutation selection balance. Now, the other way that you can get these bad genes at high frequency is by genetic drift. Now, genetic drift is the random fluctuation of allele frequencies due to chance in small populations. But in humans, one of the ways that small populations are produced is by other humans. So, for example, in the Jicarilla Apache and the Navajo Nation, the frequency of severe combined immune deficiency, SCID, is 1 per 1,000. In the world, it's 1 per million. So how did this happen? It happened during the long march out of Texas into Arizona, in which thousands of Jicarilla and Navajo people died. And by blind, dumb, bad luck, those who were carrying SCID were at higher frequency than you would predict. Now, this also happened in Eastern Europe. Okay, there are a number of very bad diseases that appear in Jews of Eastern European descent because of the Holocaust during World War II and other places. Okay, so that's how these diseases get to be at high frequency. Generally, they should be removed by mutation selection balance. Now, diseases with complex genetic foundations, such as heart disease and cancer, okay, they're called complex because many genetic loci contribute to the phenotype. And I'm going to talk about the interaction between these diseases and diseases of homeostasis and maintenance in a little second. Then there are diseases caused by environmental factors, things like malnutrition, exposure to toxic materials, both biologic and chemical. And again, in our paper on niche construction, we demonstrate how much of the disease we see in human populations results from the socialized, inequitable niche construction, which results in people being differentially exposed to environmental toxins of various types. Now, we also have diseases of homeostasis, things like type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and also mental disorders. Now, much of these result from what are called evolutionary mismatches, meaning that when we evolved as hunter-gatherers in Africa 300,000 years ago, traits or genes associated with these conditions were not disease-causing at all. But in the novel environments that we've created in industrialized and agricultural societies, they now contribute to disease. Now, one of the biggest things that's involved in creating disorders of homeostasis is food excess. So when we look at industrialized societies with high standards of living, over the 20th century, we've seen a tremendous growth in type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And that is precisely because we have diets with excess amounts of the wrong foods, and in addition, stuff that should have never been in there to begin with, like high fructose corn syrup, because it's cheaper to sweeten foods with this additive than to use regular sugar. Okay, now, lack of maintenance. All diseases associated with aging are driven by the fact that natural selection simply is never concerned with maintaining the physiological function of organisms that are not reproductive. So in other words, and I talked about this when I was involved in the experiments that first demonstrated that genes control aging, we showed that the Menawar-Williams-Hamilton theory of aging was correct. In other words, at the point at which net future expected reproduction equals 0 occurs, you start general physiological dysregulation. There's absolutely nothing that we can do about it. Now, the causes, genetic causes of this are twofold. One is antagonistic pleiotropy. So let me go backwards. Let's do mutation accumulation first. Mutation accumulation simply says that there are variants in your genome which, when you're young, don't do anything bad to you and accumulate in populations by genetic group. Now, once net future expected reproduction is 0, okay, then these variants will do whatever they do, and they will contribute to this progressive physiological dysregulation. Now, these are involved in a number of diseases associated with later age, such as Alzheimer's disease. But large genome-wide scans have shown in numerous populations the presence of these mutation accumulation alleles in humans. Now, since they're driven by drift, that means that they're going to vary in frequency in populations across the globe via no rhyme or reason. Okay. Now, this is the one that's really bad. Antagonistic pleiotropy. These are genes that play a beneficial role in early life, and none of us would be here without them. So examples of these genes are things that allow stem cells to replicate and repair damaged tissue. So you will note that cancers are more prevalent in tissues that require greater repair. So epithelial tissue in the intestines, in the skin, in the lung. Okay, these are tissues that are more likely to become tumors because they're already predisposed by a few mutations to go bonkers and do what they want. So I actually call this condition sort of genomic chaos. In other words, once net future expected reproduction is 0, anything can happen. Everything's on the table. And unfortunately, that leads to us having a whole bunch of diseases, which of course are influenced by the environment in which we live in. And so the idea that lack of maintenance occurs is real. How it occurs and for which individuals has a lot to do with environmental factors. All right, last two are more rare. Stochastic developmental problems like Turner syndrome, maternal offspring, maternal-paternal conflict. And all these things interact with each other, but they're also not racialized. And that's the point that we make, that these causes of diseases occur across populations. They may be at different frequencies in different groups, but they do not correlate with socially defined racial groups. And the reason for that comes in this next slide. How much time do I have? 0? 8 minutes. All right, so 8 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick course in quantitative genetics. And basically, in that 8 minutes, all phenotypes that we see, that is, disease as a phenotype, are determined by the interaction of genes, environment, gene by environment interaction, and twice the covariance of genes and environment. Now, in racially structured societies, the biggest determiner of differences in disease phenotypes are not genes. They're VE, VG by E, and the covariance of GE. Meaning people are exposed to environments that expose their genetic vulnerabilities. Now, a good example of that is estimates of heritability for various socially defined groups in New York City over the 20th century. So we found the heritability of lifespan in European Americans in New York City at 0.3. Now, some of the best twin studies of the heritability of longevity carried out on Swedish twin pairs living in the same environment are going to give you a heritability of 0.333, meaning 33% of that lifespan is determined by genes, 67% by the environment. So in New York City, in the 20th century, in European Americans, 30% genes, 70% environment. But Caribbean Hispanics, only 15% genes, 85% environment. In African Americans, only 10% genes, 90% environment. What that means is that structural racism denies racialized groups of their genetic potential for life. Numerous studies that I've cited below supporting that contention. Now, since I only have a few more minutes, I want to show you this last thing, okay? So if one were going to hang their hat on genomic differences between biological races, accounting for disease differential, you should be able to show good genes in the group that has the bad health and bad genes in the group that has the good health. So when Lohmiller et al. Looked at proportionally or potentially deleterious genetic variation in European and African populations, they found that potentially bad genes were statistically significantly the same, meaning no difference between Europeans and Africans. But in probably deleterious genes, European Americans have higher amounts of probably deleterious genes compared to African Americans. And so if you're claiming that genes account for health disparity, which African Americans have more of them than Europeans, the pattern should be the exact opposite. But what we find is that it's actually African populations that have less deleterious genetic variation. And by the way, I've looked at this in specific genetic systems like hypertension and found that African Americans actually have higher frequency of protective alleles compared to European Americans. And so at the end of the day, none of this genetics of health disparity stands. So given that we're out of time and I can't stand up here anymore, I'm going to take questions from the audience. And I'm going to sit.
Thank you so much. And so we have questions from the audience as well as questions from online. And okay, so do we have questions? And we will be mic runners.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves, for that great talk. I've seen the admixture studies before, and I always get stuck on the same point.
Okay.
How do you define you're saying a group of people, and then you define their genetics based on what we would consider our racial groups? I know it's ancestry, but I always get stuck.
Ancestry and race.
Can you explain how
I'm
you
going
different?
to explain. So in modern biology, okay, biological races are defined by the amount of genetic variation within groups in a species versus the amount of genetic variation between those groups within a species. We can measure this with a number of population genetic metrics. One of them is Wright's population subdivision statistic, which has been measured in human populations. And it shows incontrovertibly there's not enough genetic variation between groups to define any of these groups as geographical races or subspecies. The second criterion for the existence of a biological race is whether any group can be considered a phylogenetically or unique evolutionary lineage. So we've done phylogenetic trees of human populations, and no human populations are unique lineages. The only ones that would possibly qualify as a possible unique lineage would be, San hunter-gatherers of South Africa. And that tree would look like, on one side, the San, and on the other side, all other humans. Right, so that doesn't match our socio-defined definitions of race either. Okay, so now ancestry has to do with that adaptation that I was talking about when humans began to migrate around the globe out of Africa. Okay, most of the genetic variation that we see in humans is due to random chance or genetic drift. Now, this is computed from portions of the human genome that do not encode proteins. So most people don't know this, but of your genome, which is 3.3 billion base pairs, only about 93% of it, only about 7% of it either encodes a protein or regulates the encoding of the protein. 93% of it, as far as we know, does nothing. Because it does nothing, okay, mutations can accumulate in those segments that are specific with time and place, because natural selection doesn't remove them, it does nothing. So when companies like 23andMe and Ancestry, when they give you an ancestry estimation, they are not using protein coding genes, because those are under natural selection, and those are uniform across humans. As you saw from that figure I showed with all the stuff that changed, most of the stuff didn't change. So to get a signal for ancestry, you have to use non-coding portions of the genome, which accumulate these mutations by blind unblind. And that can accurately determine for populations that haven't changed their size or haven't had a lot of migration in and out, it accurately determine, where your ancestors came from. But the further you go back in time, we all coalesce to African ancestry. So what they're giving you is recent ancestry in that 100,000, and in most places, they're really only looking back maybe 5 or 6 generations. But you're really talking about recent ancestry, where your folks came from. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
She's our resident anthropologist. We have a question from online.
Yes, would you like me to read it out?
Yes, please.
This question is from Frances Howell. She said, in the beginning of your presentation, you connected slavery to our current understanding of, quote, it's not race, it's racism. Since 2020, there has been a huge increase in scholars focusing on racism in their work, yet very few people link our country's historical legacy of slavery to current racial health inequities. I'm curious to know your thoughts on the responsibility that scholars have on talking about how slavery still impacts medical racism and contemporary health inequities today.
Well, to make a long story short, I think that scholars need to be doing a better job of putting forward that narrative. Now, I've been spending day in and day out over the last 30 years making that argument, but but we should also be careful about trying to relate too much of what happened in slavery to the conditions that are impacting health today. That would be a real mistake. So one example of a misconception that's quite common is the one that Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Oz perpetrated on the United States when they claimed that higher amounts of hypertension in African Americans was due to the transatlantic slave voyage, and that people survived by having better genes to retain salt, and that there was a shortage of salt in Africa. Turns out that all of that narrative is false. Okay? And in fact, if you were actually thinking about who should have more genes for retaining salt, it wouldn't be the tropical population that was moved to the subtropics of South Carolina. It would be the temperate population of Northwest England that were moved to the subtropical populations of South Carolina, right? They're the ones that would need to retain more salt to stay alive, not the Africans. But nobody ever makes that argument, except me.
We have one, here you go. Hi, Dr. Graves, thank you for your talk. Also, in recent years, we see a lot of calls for and attempts to recruit in order to achieve more racial diversity in genetic samples in science. As a matter of, and it's framed in this way, as a matter of racial equity and racial justice. And I was hoping you could comment on that enterprise and what's productive about it and what's problematic about it, and how we should parse it, given that implicitly in there is the propagation of the idea of an essentialist understanding of race, and the idea that there are meaningful genetic differences between racial groups. Since it is framed in terms of race, it's not framed in terms of ancestry, geographic diversity, etc.
All right, so let's go to a parallel universe where white supremacy doesn't exist. And we had an opportunity to set up biomedical sampling correctly. In that parallel universe, you would oversample Africa. The reason you would oversample Africa is the graph that I showed of heterozygosity with geographic distance from Africa. Most of the genetic variability within our species resides in Africa. So if I'm looking for idiosyncratic responses, say, to drugs, I want to sample the population that has the most genetic variation, because that's where you would find those idiosyncratic responses to the drugs in question. Flip back to the world we live in, where the medical infrastructure was always more about the health of persons of European descent. And they sampled people of European descent, missing most of the genetic variability within our species. And therefore, such drugs are far more likely to have impacts that are idiosyncratic to populations outside of Northwest Europeans. And so therefore, even though they're couching it in terms of essentialist ideas of race, their idea is sort of correct, that if you want to do these studies properly, you have to now oversample people who are not Europeans. Our task is to take away the essentialism and give them, a course in, modern scientific genetics. And again, I've been working very hard at that over the last couple of years.
Thank you, that's very helpful. We have another question.
Dr. Graves, thank you very much for the talk. I lived half of my life in Europe and learned more about racism in America in the last 25, 30 years. If you were to look at the globe, we know the United States is towards the end of that extreme, but is there an index, or is there a way to look at other countries structured similarly to US and the racialization of the society and their history included? Or is US really unique in its
No, I
place?
mean, the United States, the whole point about the social definition of race or social construction of race is that it's always historically and culturally contextual. Always historically and culturally contextual. So right now I'm working with a group of scholars at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, where the vast majority of enslaved persons were taken to Brazil, not to North America. In Brazil, there are like 20 different categories of socially defined race based upon the combination of skin complexion and physical traits. And all of these terms are meaningful to people in Brazil. Most of those people coming to the United States, they're just called Black, right? In Brazil, they're not. So the good news is that these colleagues at São Paulo are trying to get racism, not race, translated into Portuguese so that they can do education there on these very topics that we discussed today. So the important take home is that the United States has a historic, unique construction of race that is different from the way race is constructed in Brazil, different from the way it's constructed in the UK. I mean, I went to the UK in the 80s and hung out with a group of guys who clearly, from my view, were Han Chinese, but they called themselves Black. Okay, we had a great time. We were in Brixton. We were listening to ska and reggae. They considered themselves Black. Okay, different construction. So that's what we need to understand. Socially defined groups exist in the context of the society in question and for the purpose of social hierarchy.
Thank you for your discussion, Ms. Graves. Early on, I guess I hope that you had discussed or broken down like Jean Baudin, Francis Baudin, and the like, and how they constructed race theory, right? Dealing with bottleneck theory and degeneracy theory. But then on the backhand side of it, I also wanted to know like what your opinion is of appropriation, right? And how that also transcends into healthcare or miscare as we know it. And then looking at how the United States spends more on healthcare than most other high income countries, but has the outcomes that we do. And if it relates to race still being a predominant factor.
So I can honestly tell you, I'm not familiar with the theories that you described at all. So that may be because of my limited, exposure. But I will talk about healthcare in the United States, which is, an international disgrace. It's an international disgrace because it's not about taking care of people's health. It's a profit-driven industry. So when I was interviewed by the New England Journal of Medicine, and the final question that was dropped in the interview was, well, Dr. Graves, how would you improve health outcomes and reduce health disparities? Okay. I'm counting the number of words. Universal health care. 3 words. That's how you would eliminate health disparities. Okay, you wouldn't get it all in the first pass. But the reason my wife's heart condition is so bad, and we're I don't make Columbia type money, but I make a decent, type money for a professor. But my wife was afraid to go to her heart doctor because of the cost of each one of her visits. And I have health insurance. I work in a professional job. The vast majority of people in this country do not have adequate health insurance. Okay, nor do they have the education to even know what they should be looking for. Which is why when you look at, health conditions, education is one of the biggest variables determining outcomes. So if we were serious about addressing health disparity in justice, we would be about justice. But we're not. This is a society that is mired in the notion that your worth is determined by how much you make and how much you have. And we will never be able to address these issues until we are willing to adopt a new paradigm. I believe that universal health care is right. Every person born in this country should be given adequate health care. There's no excuse for this. Other countries do it. It's not like, we can't. We're supposedly the leading intellectual center, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And we can't give adequate health care to all Americans? Please.
Well, I think that is a great close. Thank you so much, especially for the Maryland Public Health University of the Biomedical background. Thank you, Dr. Graves. And you will now have lunch with the students. They can pick your brain further. Thank you all for coming. If you won free books, you can see Gerald to the right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming in person. And thank you for those who are online.
Wonderful. I think Joe's gonna walk you back. I gotta rush off, but I will